My name is Catherine. I'm 33 years old. And I am the CEO of a private equity firm that acquires distressed corporate debt. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you've ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who thought you were weak. The trap was set 48 hours before the wedding. At the rehearsal dinner, we were seated in the grand dining room of a sprawling mansion in the Hamptons. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over my brother's 50 closest friends. Waiters in white jackets circled the room with trays of expensive caviar and imported champagne, making sure every guest felt like royalty. I was eating my salad quietly at a table near the back. Suddenly, my mother, Beatrice, marched right up to me. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how my flight from New York City was. She just dropped a thick leather folder into my lap, causing my heavy silver fork to clatter against my plate. Inside was a catering bill for $400. Ling ling ling. I looked up at her perfectly manicured face. She leaned in close so the wealthy guests at the next table wouldn't hear her venom. You need to put this on your black Amex right now, she whispered sharply. Derek's investment accounts are temporarily frozen due to a massive portfolio transfer. He can't access his liquid assets until Monday. I slowly wiped my mouth with a linen napkin and handed the folder back to her. No, I said. My voice was calm. But ferme. Her eyes widened. She wasn't used to hearing me say no in public. What do you mean? No, she hissed, leaning in closer. It's a temporary hold. Catherine, you're his sister. You run a hedge fund. You have the money. Do not embarrass us. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, refusing to break eye contact. I have the money, Beatrice, I replied. But I'm not spending it on his lobster thermidor. I paid for his Porsche when he was 22 because you forced me to max out my student loans to cover it. I spent 5 years paying off that debt while he totaled the car twice. I'm 33 now. I no longer finance his fake billionaire lifestyle. My mother went pale. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. Before she could spit out another threat, heavy footsteps approached from behind. It was my brother, Derek. He looked flawless in his custom-tailored tuxedo, but his face was twisted in an ugly rage. He had been watching us from the head table. What's the problem here? Derek demanded, glaring down at me. Mom says you're causing a scene over a simple cash flow issue. Are you really going to ruin my rehearsal dinner just because you're too petty to help your own flesh and blood? Before I could answer, a soft, elegant voice broke the tension. Derek, is everything all right? I looked up and saw Samantha, his beautiful fiancée. She was dressed in a stunning white silk gown. Samantha came from a very wealthy, highly respected old money family in Boston. She was intelligent and carried herself with undeniable grace. But when she looked at me, her warm eyes held a glint of confusion and disappointment. Derek instantly softened his face, playing the absolute victim. He reached out and pulled Samantha close, kissing her temple. It's nothing, sweetheart, Derek sighed, shaking his head tragically. My sister is refusing to cover the catering bill because my fund's merger locked up my accounts this week. I guess she's still holding on to some childhood grudges. Samantha looked at the $400. Null bill. And then at me. Frowning. Catherine, she said softly, her tone full of genuine pity. In my family, we always have each other's backs. You run a massive financial firm. Are you really going to humiliate your own brother over a temporary bank hold on the happiest weekend of his life? I looked at Samantha, seeing exactly how my brother had completely brainwashed this brilliant woman. She honestly believed he was a titan of industry, experiencing a minor banking glitch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend my character. I just reached into my designer bag and pulled out my heavy metal credit card. "All right," I said, tossing the black Amex directly onto the $400. "000 invoice. Pay the caterer. Consider it my final contribution to this family." Derek flashed a smug, victorious smile at our mother. He had won again. He had publicly shamed the family scapegoat into paying his bills. But as the waiter approached to take the folder, I saw something they didn't. Derek's cell phone, which he had left face up on my table, lit up with an urgent email notification. The bright screen displayed a message from a major federal bank. It read, "Urgent notice of asset liquidation." Derek had no idea that his entire financial existence was about to be completely destroyed. His fake empire was already on fire. And I was the one holding the match. The notification vanished from the screen before Derek even noticed it. He was too busy soaking up the sympathetic gaze of his fiancée. Samantha gently placed her hand over his, rubbing his knuckles softly. She looked at me from across the table with an expression of polite disapproval. I could see the exact narrative playing out in her mind. Derek had painted himself as the golden boy who built an empire from nothing, while carrying the burden of a jealous sister, Catherine. "I know family dynamics can be complicated," Samantha said smoothly. Her voice was steady and measured exactly what you'd expect from someone raised in Boston, high society. "Derek has been nothing but generous to everyone in this room. He paid for my parents' flights. And he booked this venue. I understand you might feel overshadowed. But bringing up old loans at our rehearsal dinner is unnecessary." I sat perfectly still, letting her words hang in the air. The irony was suffocating. I was a self-made millionaire who dismantled failing corporations for a living. Meanwhile, the man sitting next to her was secretly drowning in toxic debt. But I didn't defend myself. Anything I said right now would only make me look like the bitter sister Derek claimed I was. Derek let out a heavy sigh and squeezed Samantha's hand. "Let it go, Sam," he said, his voice dripping with fake exhaustion. "Catherine has always resented my success. Ever since I launched my first startup. She's been keeping score. It's exhausting. But I've learned to live with it. You can't force someone to celebrate you when they're drowning in insecurities." My mother, Beatrice, chimed in, leaning over the table to pat Derek's arm. "Don't let her ruin your night. Sweetheart. Your sister has always had a cold heart. We invited her out of obligation because we are a forgiving family. The least she could do is pretend to be happy instead of radiating negativity." I looked at the three of them, a delusional mother, a con artist brother, and a fiancé who had no idea she was marrying into bankruptcy. "Keeping score?" Derek asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "That's an interesting way to put it." Before Derek could reply, the waiter returned with a small silver tray holding the $400. "000 receipt." He placed it in front of me. I picked up the heavy gold pen and signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes. I didn't leave a tip on the card, because I had already handed cash to the waitstaff earlier. As I pushed the tray away, my father, Richard, strolled over from the bar. He was holding a glass of expensive bourbon, swirling the amber liquid. "I see the financial crisis was averted," he boomed, clapping Derek on the shoulder. "Good of you to finally chip in. Catherine, I was starting to think you forgot what the word family means. I expect a much better attitude from you at the ceremony tomorrow." I stood up, smoothing down my tailored dress. I picked up my clutch and looked my father dead in the eye. My attitude tomorrow will be exactly what this family deserves. Richard. I replied. I turned to leave, but stopped right behind Derek's chair. At that exact moment, his phone lit up for the second time. The screen was blindingly bright against the dim lighting. Samantha looked down, frowning. Derek. Your phone keeps buzzing. A hint of real concern entered her voice. Is everything okay with the fund? That notification says urgent. Derek snapped his head around and snatched the phone off the table. His face went pale for a fraction of a second before he forced an artificial smile. Just a minor compliance issue. Honey. He lied smoothly, sliding the phone into his tuxedo pocket. Nothing my legal team can't handle by Monday morning. You know how these algorithms overreact to large transfers. I leaned in just slightly, so my voice was right next to his ear. You better check on that minor compliance issue. Derek. I whispered coldly. The market can be unpredictable. 1 minute you're a billionaire, and the next you're liquidating everything just to stay out of federal prison. Derek's head snapped around, his eyes flashing with genuine panic. What did you just say to me? He demanded. Go back to your hotel room. Catherine. My mother hissed. We'll see you tomorrow. Try not to ruin the wedding. 2. I gave them one last smile. I walked out of the dining room and stepped into the cool Hamptons night air. They thought the worst was over. They had absolutely no idea that the real nightmare hadn't even begun. I arrived at the Hamptons estate early the next morning to watch the final hours of my brother's illusion. The bridal suite was thick with the scent of hairspray and fresh roses. Samantha sat in the main room while a makeup artist worked on her skin. She looked genuinely radiant, completely unaware of the financial disaster she was about to marry into. I retreated to the antechamber and poured myself a cup of black coffee. I wanted peace. But my parents had other plans. The heavy door clicked shut behind me. I turned to see Beatrice and Richard stepping inside. Their faces were stripped of the fake joy they had been projecting outside. Richard quickly locked the door, trapping us in. Beatrice marched straight toward me, her heels clicking sharply. She didn't say good morning. She threw a thick manila folder onto the vanity next to my coffee. Sign it, she demanded in an urgent hiss. I looked past her at my father, who was acting like a cheap bouncer. What is this? I asked, taking a deliberate sip of my coffee. It's a standard equity transfer. Richard grunted, stepping forward. You are transferring your 30% stake in the family real estate firm to Derek. It's your wedding gift to him. It shows family solidarity. It proves you're committed to us, and not just your own selfish ambitions. I opened the folder. The legal jargon was dense, but my eyes caught the critical clauses. It was an unconditional transfer of my founder's shares. These were the shares I earned by working 80-hour weeks in my 20s to get their failing properties off the ground. You want me to hand Derek the equity I built from scratch? I asked, keeping my tone level, so he can use it to impress Samantha's family. Beatrice leaned in, her eyes narrowing. Samantha comes from a prominent family. Catherine. Her father is a retired federal judge in Boston. They expect Derek's portfolio to match their social status. Your 30% will bump his net worth up to the bracket they expect. It's the least you can do after humiliating us last night. I looked past my mother, toward the open doorway. I could hear Samantha laughing softly over the hum of a hairdryer. She had no idea her future in-laws were actively extorting their own daughter to uphold a massive lie. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the marble vanity. I'm not signing anything, I said simply. My shares belong to me. If Derek wants to impress a federal judge, he should try getting a real job instead of playing make-believe with my hard-earned assets. Richard's face flushed bright red. He took a heavy step forward, pointing a thick finger in my face. You ungrateful brat. He snarled, his voice vibrating with fury. We gave you everything. We fed you and clothed you. Is this how you repay us? You are going to sign that paper right now. Or I swear to God, I will make sure every single person in our social circle knows exactly how ruthless you are. You will be ruined. I looked at my furious father and my desperate mother. For a fraction of a second, I felt a flicker of the old childhood fear they used to control me. But then I remembered the federal notification I saw flashing on Derek's phone. I threw my head back and let out a genuine, sharp laugh. It echoed loudly in the small room, completely breaking their intimidation tactic. What's so funny? Beatrice snapped, her hands balling into tight fists. Do you think our family legacy is a joke? I stopped laughing and stepped closer to my mother, my expression turning to ice. I'm laughing because the two of you are completely delusional. I whispered sharply. You want me to sign over my shares to inflate Derek's net worth. You clearly haven't looked at the company ledgers in months. The family business isn't an asset, Beatrice. It is drowning in $25 million of toxic commercial debt. Richard froze. His arm dropped awkwardly to his side. Beatrice's jaw completely fell open. What are you talking about? She stammered, her confidence evaporating. The company is profitable. Derek manages the accounts himself. Derek has been using the company as collateral to fund his luxury lifestyle. I replied, my voice slicing through the room like a blade. Giving him my shares wouldn't make him richer. It would only make me legally liable for the $25 million he owes the bank. So no. Richard, I will not sign your little contract. But you should probably ask your golden boy why his accounts are actually frozen. The silence that followed my words was heavy and suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the hairdryer from the next room, where Samantha was blissfully getting ready for the happiest day of her life. Inside our locked antechamber, the atmosphere was poisonous. Beatrice stared at me, her chest heaving as her mind struggled to process the reality of Derek's financial ruin. But instead of questioning her precious golden boy, she chose the path she always took. She chose violence against the scapegoat. Her hand moved faster than I anticipated. The sharp crack of her palm striking my left cheek echoed off the marble walls. The force of the slap turned my head to the side, and a hot, burning pain instantly bloomed across my skin. My coffee cup rattled slightly on the vanity. For a moment, no one moved. Richard stood there breathing heavily, fists clenched at his sides, as if ready to back up his wife's physical assault. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I slowly turned my head back to face my mother. I raised my hand and gently touched my burning cheek, feeling the heat radiating from the red mark she had just left. You ungrateful, cruel liar, Beatrice hissed, her voice shaking with uncontrolled rage. How dare you make up such disgusting lies about your brother on his wedding day? Derek is brilliant. He is a success. You are just trying to poison his marriage before it even starts because you are bitter and alone. Richard stepped closer, looming over me in his expensive tuxedo. Listen to me very carefully, Catherine, he growled, pointing a finger inches from my face. I don't care about whatever imaginary numbers you think you saw. You are going to pick up that pen, and you are going to sign over those shares right now. If you don't, I swear, this family is done with you. We will go out there tonight in front of 500 of the most influential people in New York and Boston, and we will publicly disown you. You will be cut off from the family trust. You will lose our name, our connections, and our protection. You will be nothing to us. I looked at my father, watching the vein bulge in his neck. He actually thought he held the ultimate trump card. For 33 years. The threat of being cast out of the family was the weapon they used to keep me in line. They used it to make me pay for Derek's car. They used it to make me work for free in their failing business. They thought my greatest fear was being abandoned by them. They didn't realize I had outgrown them a long time ago. I looked down at the contract on the table. An equity transfer meant I would be legally tied to the $25 million debt they were trying to hide. But a formal disinheritance. That was an entirely different legal mechanism. If they formally severed ties and removed me from the family trust, it would officially dissolve my liability as a founding partner in their corrupt company. I lowered my hand from my cheek and smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that made Richard take a step back. "You want to disown me?" I asked. My voice eerily calm in contrast to their screaming. "You want to cut me out of the family trust and strip me of the family name?" "Yes," Beatrice spat, crossing her arms defensively. "We will erase you. Catherine. You will leave this estate today with absolutely nothing. No family. And no future." I picked up my purse and slipped it over my shoulder. "Then do it," I challenged, looking directly into my mother's eyes. "If you want to disown me, don't just threaten me behind closed doors. Do it in writing. I want a formal, notarized letter of disinheritance, signed by both of you and Derek. And I want it tonight, at the reception. In front of all 500 influential guests you care so much about." Richard narrowed his eyes, looking at me like I had lost my mind. "You're bluffing." I scoffed. "You don't have the stomach to face that kind of public humiliation." "Try me," I replied, walking toward the unlocked door. "Present the letter at the dinner. If you give me that document tonight, I will gladly walk away from this family forever. But until then, I am not signing a single thing." Beatrice let out a cruel, condescending laugh. She reached out and grabbed the doorframe, her eyes flashing with triumphant malice. "You asked for it, Catherine," she sneered. "I'll have the estate lawyer drafted up this afternoon. Tonight, everyone will know exactly what a toxic disappointment you are. Enjoy the ceremony, because it will be your last family event." I pushed past her, stepping back into the brightly lit hallway. I could hear Samantha laughing happily in the next room. Beatrice thought she had just secured the ultimate victory. She was completely unaware that she had just eagerly agreed to walk straight into my master legal trap. The grand lawn of the Hamptons estate had been transformed into a stunning venue. 500 white wooden chairs were perfectly aligned, facing the sparkling Atlantic Ocean. Massive arches of imported white roses and orchids framed the altar where my brother would soon stand. A string quartet played softly in the background, filling the salty air with elegant music. Wealthy guests draped in designer silk and expensive diamonds chattered excitedly as they took their assigned seats in the front rows. I walked past the politicians, local celebrities, and rich socialites my parents had invited to flaunt their fake status. I followed the usher to the very back of the seating arrangement. My assigned seat was in the last possible row, intentionally positioned right next to the metal, swinging doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed past, the loud clatter of industrial silverware and shouting chefs completely drowned out the string quartet. It was a petty final insult from Beatrice and Richard. They wanted to make sure I knew exactly where I stood in their hierarchy. I sat down, smoothing my dress, completely unfazed by their childish games. A few minutes later, a tall, dignified black man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit approached and sat in the empty chair next to me. He let out a slow, steady breath, and checked his expensive silver watch. He carried an air of absolute authority, but his eyes were warm and kind. I recognized him immediately from the engagement photos. It was Judge Sterling, Samantha's father. "It's quite a crowd today," he said, offering a polite smile. I needed to step away from the front and catch my breath before the procession starts. Giving away your only daughter is a heavier job than I expected. I smiled back, extending my hand. "It's completely understandable," I replied. "I'm Catherine, Derek's sister." The judge's face lit up with genuine pleasure, and he shook my hand firmly. "Catherine," he exclaimed softly, "it is a pleasure to finally meet you. Derek has told us so much about your financial firm. Samantha was just saying how impressed she is by your career. We are very proud to have Derek joining our family. He's a remarkably driven young man." I kept my expression perfectly neutral. "He certainly is driven," I agreed carefully. Judge Sterling leaned back, looking out over the sea of guests, with a proud, paternal gleam in his eye. "I spent 30 years on the federal bench seeing the worst sides of humanity," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. "It makes you protective. I'll admit, I had my investigators look into your brother when he first proposed to Samantha. But his portfolio is impeccable. The family real estate business he runs is incredibly solid. In fact, I was so impressed with his vision for their upcoming commercial expansion that I decided to help him secure his next big move." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my face totally calm. "A commercial expansion?" I asked, keeping my tone light. I didn't realize he was expanding so soon. "Oh, yes." Judge Sterling nodded proudly. "He's acquiring 3 new luxury properties in Manhattan. The capital requirements were high, so I used my connections at the bank to personally co-sign a $50 million bridge loan for him. The funds were wired directly into his corporate account yesterday afternoon. I consider it an investment in my daughter's future." A cold shiver ran through my entire body. The noise from the catering kitchen seemed to fade away completely as my brain processed the sheer magnitude of what the judge had just confessed. Derek didn't have a commercial expansion planned. Derek was drowning in $25 million of toxic debt, and his accounts were frozen by federal regulators. If Judge Sterling co-signed a $50 million loan, and those funds went directly into Derek's corporate accounts, Derek wasn't just a failing businessman anymore. He was actively committing massive federal wire fraud. He had falsified documents. I lied about his assets, and used his fiancée's wealthy father to secure millions under false pretenses. The string quartet suddenly stopped playing. A new, triumphant song began, signaling the start of the ceremony. Judge Sterling stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a proud smile. "That's my cue," he said warmly. "It was wonderful to meet you, Catherine." I watched this brilliant, honorable man walk down the aisle to hand his daughter over to a desperate criminal. The second he was out of sight, I reached into my purse for my cell phone. This trap was no longer just about family drama. It was now a federal crime scene. The ceremony progressed with sickeningly sweet perfection. The ocean breeze gently ruffled Samantha's veil, as the officiant spoke about honesty and building a foundation of trust. Derek stood there looking like the perfect gentleman, holding her hands and staring deeply into her eyes. It was a flawless performance. If I didn't know the truth, I would have believed it myself, but my cell phone was burning a hole in my hand. I pulled it out of my purse, resting it discreetly in my lap. I opened my encrypted messaging app and immediately pinged my direct line to my lead legal assistant back in New York. "You online?" I typed. "Yes, boss," came the immediate reply. "What's the status of the Hamptons wedding?" "The groom just conned his new father-in-law into a $50 million bridge loan. I need you to pull the acquisition files from 3 months ago. Specifically, The Vanguard portfolio. A few seconds passed. I watched Derek gently wipe a fake tear from his eye as Samantha read her vows. It was disgusting. My phone vibrated silently. Got the Vanguard files. Boss. We acquired $100 million in defaulted commercial debt previously held by various private lenders. The primary debtor is listed as your family's real estate firm. The loans are severely delinquent and fully secured by all corporate assets. Good. I typed back quickly. Are there any restrictions on when we can collect the debt? None. When we bought the paper, we acquired all rights to demand immediate and full payment. The previous lenders were desperate to offload it for pennies on the dollar because your brother has been dodging their calls for 6 months. We own him completely. What do you want to do? I looked up from my screen. The officiant was now asking Derek to repeat his vows. I promise to protect you. Derek said, his voice projecting confidently across the manicured lawn. I promise to build a life with you that is secure and honest. I looked down and started typing furiously. He's using the family company to secure millions in new fraudulent loans to cover his tracks. My parents are fully aware and tried to force me to sign over my equity this morning to make me a financial meat shield. They are going to formally disinherit me at the reception tonight to try and cut me off before I can expose them. My assistant's reply came instantly. That's insane. If they formally disown you, and you accept it in writing, that completely severs your legal ties to their financial liabilities. They are handing you the perfect exit strategy. Exactly. I replied. I want you to prep the notice of default for every property held by the family firm. Draft the asset seizure orders for Derek's personal accounts. Done. When do you want me to file the documents in federal court? We can have marshals at their corporate office by Monday morning. No. I typed. A cold smile forming on my lips. I want it done today. I want the e-filings submitted within the hour. But it's Saturday. Boss. Courts are closed. The federal e-registry is automated. I reminded him. If we file the notices of default right now, they will generate immediate, automatic alerts to all connected financial institutions. Derek's remaining credit lines will freeze instantly. I watched as Derek slid the massive diamond ring onto Samantha's finger. It was a ring paid for with stolen money. It was a ring paid for with my money. Understood. My assistant replied. I'm prepping the filings now. Just give me the word. The officiant smiled broadly at the crowd. I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. The guests erupted in applause. My parents stood up in the front row, clapping enthusiastically, their faces beaming with pride. They thought they had secured their future. They thought they had successfully sold a lie to a federal judge and trapped a wealthy heiress in their web of debt. Derek leaned in and kissed Samantha deeply, the picture of a triumphant king. I looked down at my screen one last time. I watched the happy couple turn to face the cheering crowd. Initiate foreclosure protocol on their core assets. I sent the message. My thumb hitting send with a satisfying tap. Time the final bank freeze for the cake cutting. Let's give them a reception they will never forget. The transition from the lawn to the estate's grand ballroom was seamless. We were ushered into a massive glass conservatory draped in white silk and dripping with crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp uniforms stood by, holding silver trays loaded with glasses of vintage Dom Perignon. In the center of the room, a towering 10-tier wedding cake stood next to an elaborate two-swan ice sculpture. The live 12-piece band broke into lively jazz as the massive wooden doors swung open. Derek and Samantha made their grand entrance to thunderous applause. 500 guests stood up, cheering for the newly minted power couple. Derek walked with his chest puffed out, waving to the crowd like a conquering king returning from a victorious battle. He spun Samantha on the dance floor, dipping her for the cameras. He was soaking up every second of the attention. Completely oblivious to the financial guillotine suspended directly over his neck. I took my assigned seat at the back table. My chair was positioned so close to the catering entrance that I could feel the draft of cold air every time a waiter pushed through the swinging doors. Beatrice and Richard sat at the VIP head table, clinking glasses with Judge Sterling and his wealthy relatives. They looked incredibly smug. They thought they had secured their retirement by marrying their golden boy into Boston royalty. It took less than 30 minutes for Derek to make his way over to my table. He couldn't resist the urge to gloat. He strolled over with his arm securely wrapped around Samantha's waist, holding a glass of bourbon in his free hand. He looked down at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. Designed entirely for his bride's benefit. "Catherine, I'm so glad you stayed," Derek said, his voice dripping with fake affection. "I know you usually hate these big family gatherings, but it means a lot to us that you're here to witness this." Samantha smiled warmly at me. "It really is a beautiful reception," she added gracefully. "It's certainly an expensive one," I replied, taking a slow sip of my water. "I'm surprised you had the time to plan all this, Derek. Especially with that massive commercial expansion you're managing." Judge Sterling mentioned his generous $50 million investment. "You must be incredibly busy managing that kind of new capital." Derek's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His grip on Samantha's waist tightened slightly. "Yeah. Well, you know how it is in real estate." He laughed nervously. "We move fast. Securing prime properties in Manhattan requires aggressive capital. My father-in-law just understands the vision." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. "That's fascinating," I said, my tone perfectly conversational but laced with venom. "I assume you've already upped Ritho new debt obligations. Taking on $50 million in bridge loans requires immediate disclosure, especially if you're using your existing commercial properties as collateral." The color drained from Derek's face. A bead of sweat formed near his hairline. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the kitchen doors as if looking for an escape route. "Everything is being handled by my legal team, Catherine," he replied, his voice losing its friendly warmth. "We don't need to talk business on my wedding day." I didn't let him off the hook. I kept my eyes locked on his, watching the panic rise in his chest. "I only mention it because federal regulators are notoriously strict right now," I continued smoothly. "With a bridge loan of that magnitude, they'll scrutinize your debt-to-equity ratio immediately. If your previous loans are in default, or if your accounts happen to be frozen, a fresh $50 million wire transfer would trigger an automatic federal audit. You could be facing wire fraud charges before the honeymoon is even over. Just standard compliance. Derek, I'm sure you have it all under control." The color completely drained from Derek's face. He swallowed hard, visibly. Samantha stopped smiling. She turned her head and looked directly at Derek. She wasn't just a pretty bride, she was an educated, intelligent woman. She felt the sudden tension radiating from her new husband. "Federal audit?" Samantha asked, her voice lowering slightly. "Derek, what is she talking about? Why would your accounts be frozen?" Derek let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded completely unnatural. He quickly pulled Samantha to his side, physically steering her away from my table. "She's just joking, honey," he stammered, his voice pitching higher than normal. "You know Catherine always has to play the cynical hedge fund manager. Come on. We need to go greet the senator at table 4. He practically dragged her away, His polished black shoes slid quickly across the marble floor. Samantha followed. But she didn't smile. She pulled her shoulders in, resisting his grip for a fraction of a second. Before they disappeared into the crowded dance floor, Samantha turned her head and looked back at me over her shoulder. Her dark eyes were narrowed, her expression clouded by deep, lingering suspicion. The seed of doubt was firmly planted. The dinner service began with a choreographed procession of waiters carrying silver trays. I sat quietly at my table near the kitchen doors, cutting my steak and watching the high society guests mingle. The tension from my conversation with Derek hung in the air. But the reception moved forward exactly on schedule. After the main course was cleared, the live band stopped playing. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone and announced it was time for the toasts. My father gave a short, booming speech about legacy and wealth. Then, it was Beatrice's turn. My mother glided onto the stage, at the front of the ballroom, looking every bit the wealthy Hamptons matriarch in her silver evening gown. She took the microphone and beamed down at Derek and Samantha, who were seated at the head table, right in front of her. When I look at my son today, my heart simply overflows. Beatrice began, her voice echoing through the massive glass conservatory. Derek, you have always been the light of this family. You are ambitious, kind, and relentlessly generous. You built a real estate empire from the ground up. But you never lost your gentle spirit. And Samantha, we are incredibly blessed to welcome you into our lives. You are the perfect match for our golden boy. To the Sterling family, thank you for trusting us with your beautiful daughter. We are two great families uniting tonight. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Judge Sterling raised his glass in a dignified salute. Samantha smiled, though she looked a bit more tense than an hour ago. But then, Beatrice let out a long, shaky sigh. She lowered the microphone slightly and looked down at the floor, acting as if she were overcome by heavy, poignant émotion. The ballroom fell silent, waiting for her to continue. A mother always wants to believe her family is perfect, Beatrice said, her tone shifting from joyous to deeply sorrowful. We want to believe that love can mend any broken bond. But sometimes, a mother has to make the hardest choice of all to protect the children who are actually building a future. She slowly raised her head and pointed her manicured finger directly toward the back of the room. She pointed straight at me. Heads turned simultaneously, following her gaze to my isolated table near the kitchen doors. For 33 years, my daughter Catherine has been a dark cloud of selfishness and jealousy over this family, Beatrice declared, her voice trembling with fake tears. We gave her everything. We paid for her education. We supported her career. We tried to include her in the family business. But no matter how much love we poured into her, she only returned it with bitterness. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People started whispering behind their hands. I placed my fork on my plate and wiped my mouth with my napkin, staring back at her with absolute calm. Even today, on the happiest day of her brother's life, she has done nothing but try to sabotage him. Beatrice continued, her voice growing louder and more venomous. She refused to help with the wedding expenses. She spread cruel lies to our new in-laws. She sits in the back of this beautiful room radiating hatred because she cannot stand to see her brother succeed where she has failed. She is hollow inside. And I will not allow her toxicity to poison this beautiful new marriage. I looked at their head table. Derek was leaning back in his chair, holding a glass of champagne. Ah, smoke. Satisfied smirk on his face. He thought this was his ultimate victory. But Samantha looked absolutely horrified. She was staring up at her mother-in-law with wide eyes. completely shell-shocked by the grotesque public humiliation taking place. In her world, family matters were handled with dignity and grace behind closed doors. Seeing Beatrice humiliate her own daughter in front of 500 guests was destroying the polished illusion my parents had worked so hard to build. I have spent my entire life trying to fix her. Beatrice cried dramatically, wiping a non-existent tear from her cheek. But I can't anymore. I have to protect my son. I have to protect my family. The ballroom was dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Beatrice handed the microphone to the MC. She reached into the podium and pulled out a thick roll of parchment paper tied with a black ribbon. Without another word, she stepped off the stage. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as she marched down the center aisle of the ballroom. Her eyes were locked on me, filled with cold, merciless triumph. She was walking straight toward my table, holding the legal weapon she thought would destroy me completely. She had no idea she was walking right into my hands. Beatrice reached my small table near the kitchen doors. Her breathing was heavy from the theatrical effort, but her eyes were cold and sharp. She held the thick parchment paper above her head for a brief second, making sure every guest in the room was watching her. Then, she brought her arm down and slammed the document hard onto the center of my table. The heavy black ribbon unspooled across the white tablecloth, knocking over my crystal water glass. "Read it," Beatrice ordered, her voice projecting loud enough for the front rows of VIP tables to hear perfectly. "It is a formal, notarized declaration, effective immediately. You are no longer recognized as a member of this family. You are stripped of our name and completely removed from the family trust. Derek is now legally declared the sole heir and sole operator of the entire family empire. You get nothing, Catherine. Not a single cent. Not a single share of the company. You are entirely severed from our legacy." A collective gasp echoed through the massive conservatory. The high society guests, who had just finished eating an expensive steak, now stared in absolute shock. Whispers broke out across the ballroom like a sudden gust of wind. I looked past Beatrice. I saw Richard marching down the aisle to stand directly behind his wife. Derek was right beside him, leaving Samantha completely alone at the head table. Derek's face beamed with arrogant satisfaction. He crossed his arms over his custom tuxedo, looking down at me like I was a pest that had finally been exterminated. "Did you hear your mother?" Richard barked, his voice tight with aggression. "The document is signed and legally binding. You have been formally disinherited. Now, I want you to stand up, get your purse, and walk out through those kitchen doors. Leave this estate immediately before I have the security team physically drag you out to the street." Derek chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Catherine." Derek added, his tone dripping with fake pity. "You played your little games and you lost. Just walk away and let the real family celebrate in peace." I shifted my gaze back to the front of the room. Samantha had stood up from her chair. Her beautiful face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the head table. She looked at her new husband and her new in-laws with absolute disgust. Next to her, Judge Sterling had set his napkin down on his plate, his jaw locked in silent fury. In his world of prestigious law and honorable conduct, the public humiliation of a family member was considered the ultimate taboo. Samantha was witnessing the true, cruel nature of the people she had just legally bound herself to. She took a half-step forward, as if wanting to intervene, but remained frozen in shock. Beatrice and Richard were waiting for the breakdown. They were expecting me to burst into tears, beg for forgiveness, or scream in humiliation. They wanted a dramatic exit to validate their cruel narrative in front of their wealthy peers. But I didn't give them a single tear. I didn't even frown. Instead, I reached out and picked up the heavy parchment paper. The edges were crisp, and the paper smelled faintly of fresh ink and sealing wax. I unfolded it slowly, flattening it on the table next to my dinner plate. I read the legal text carefully. It was perfectly drafted by their expensive estate lawyers. It explicitly stated that I was removed from all family trusts, all corporate liabilities, and all shared assets. I slid my finger to the bottom of the page. There they were. 3 fresh signatures in dark blue ink: Beatrice, Richard, and Derek. Right below their names was the official, embossed seal of a licensed New York notary public. They actually did it. They had legally severed me from their sinking financial ship. I looked up from the paper. Beatrice was glaring at me with her hands firmly planted on her hips, tapping her foot against the marble floor. "Well," Beatrice snapped impatiently. "Are you going to leave? Or do I need to call the guards?" I carefully folded the document and slid it into my designer bag, keeping it perfectly safe. Then, I slowly stood up from my chair and smoothed down the front of my dress. I looked at Beatrice, then at Richard, and finally at Derek. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. I didn't sound destroyed. I sounded incredibly relieved. I smiled warmly at the 3 of them. "Thank you," I said, my voice ringing with crystal-clear confidence. This is exactly what I needed. The silence in the room shifted from shock to absolute confusion. Beatrice froze with her mouth slightly open, unable to comprehend why her ultimate punishment had just been met with a warm smile. Richard crossed his arms aggressively, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. They expected me to run out the kitchen doors, crying. But I didn't move toward the exit. Instead, I calmly reached into my black designer tote bag, sitting on the chair beside me. My hand bypassed my wallet and my keys, until my fingers wrapped around a thick, heavy manila envelope. I pulled it out and placed it on the table right next to my discarded dinner plate. The envelope was entirely unmarked, except for a massive, dark red wax seal pressed firmly into the center flap. The deep crimson color stood out violently against the pristine white tablecloth. The MC lowered his microphone. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I picked up the heavy envelope and stepped out from behind my table. I didn't look at Beatrice or Richard as I walked forward. I completely ignored my father's angry demands for the security team to remove me. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, echoing through the silent conservatory. I walked straight down the center aisle, past the rows of wealthy guests who were now leaning out of their seats to get a better look. "What are you doing?" Beatrice hissed, stepping directly into my path, her silver evening gown shimmering under the chandeliers. "I told you to leave this estate right now." I didn't even break my stride. I simply sidestepped her, keeping my eyes locked on the head table at the front of the room. Richard tried to grab my arm as I passed, but I quickly dodged his reach. "Don't touch me, Richard," I said, my voice low, but carrying enough authority to make him freeze in his tracks. "You just legally declared that I am not your daughter. That means you have absolutely no right to tell me what to do." I closed the distance to the front of the room. Derek had finally lost his arrogant smirk. He scrambled up from his chair, pushing it back so hard, it nearly tipped over. He saw the thick envelope in my hands, and his eyes darted frantically around the room. He knew I was a hedge fund manager. He knew I bought corporate debt. The realization of what might be inside that envelope hit him like a freight train. His fake billionaire posture completely collapsed. "Catherine, stop right there," Derek demanded, his voice cracking slightly. He rushed around the front of the head table, moving to block my path to Samantha. Whatever game you're playing. It ends now. Security. Get her out of here. I stopped walking. Standing just 3 feet away from my brother, I held out the red-sealed envelope, reaching past him directly toward his beautiful bride. This is for you, Samantha, I said, my voice perfectly steady. Consider it a late wedding gift. It contains everything you need to know about the man you just married. Derek lunged forward, his face contorting into a mask of pure panic. He reached out aggressively with both hands, trying to snatch the envelope from my grip. Don't listen to her, Sam, he shouted desperately. She's crazy, give me that envelope right now. Before Derek's fingers could even brush the thick paper, a massive hand clamped firmly onto his shoulder. The grip was so powerful that Derek let out a sharp gasp and stumbled backward. It was Judge Sterling. Samantha's father had stepped down from the raised VIP platform with surprising speed for a man his age. He placed himself between Derek and me. His tall, imposing figure completely overshadowing my frantic brother. The judge didn't yell. He didn't lose his temper. He simply looked down at Derek with the cold, terrifying authority of a man who had spent 30 years sending criminals to federal prison. Let my daughter read it, the judge ordered, his voice booming through the silent ballroom like distant thunder. Derek swallowed hard, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. But, sir, he stammered, taking another step back. She's lying. She's trying to ruin us. Judge Sterling ignored him completely. He turned his dignified gaze to me and gave a single, short nod of approval. I took a step forward and placed the heavy envelope directly into Samantha's trembling hands. Samantha looked down at the dark red wax. She looked at Derek, who was now sweating profusely, tugging nervously at the collar of his custom tuxedo. Then she looked at me, her dark eyes wide with apprehension. With a sharp crack, she broke the wax seal. She tore open the flap and pulled out the thick stack of legal papers. The entire ballroom seemed to lean closer. Samantha stared at the very first page. Printed at the top, in bold black letters, was a notice of default from a federal court. And right beneath the official seal, it was stamped with today's date. Samantha's eyes scanned the thick black text printed on the official federal letterhead. Her voice shook slightly as she began to read the document aloud to the dead silent ballroom. Notice of default and intent to seize assets, she read, her voice echoing off the glass walls of the massive conservatory. The primary debtor is listed as Derek, and the total outstanding balance is $100 million. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of 500 high society guests. The wealthy elite of the Hamptons and Boston stared at the golden boy standing by the head table. Derek looked like he was going to vomit. The color had drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child caught in a massive lie. He is not a billionaire, I said, stepping closer to the table so my voice would carry across the room. My brother has been maintaining a massive financial illusion for years. He is $100 million in debt to private lenders. He hasn't made a single payment in 6 months. His personal accounts are completely empty, and his credit lines are entirely frozen. Beatrice let out a sharp shriek and covered her mouth with both hands. Richard took a step toward me with clenched fists, but Judge Sterling shot him a look so lethal that my father froze instantly in his tracks. He used the family real estate business as collateral to secure those massive loans. I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. That is why my parents cornered me in the bridal suite this morning. They handed me a contract and tried to force me to sign over my 30% stake in the family company. They said it was a wedding gift to help Derek impress Samantha's wealthy family. But it was a trap. They knew the company was drowning in toxic debt. They wanted me to sign my shares so I would be legally responsible for the fallout when the federal bank finally came knocking. They wanted me to be their financial meat shield. The ballroom erupted in horrified whispers. Guests began pulling out their cell phones. Samantha dropped the first page and looked at the second document in the stack. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she processed the numbers. "This is a wire transfer log," Samantha said, her voice cracking. "It shows the $50 million bridge loan my father co-signed yesterday. The money didn't go toward a commercial expansion. It was immediately routed to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands to cover a defaulted margin call." Judge Sterling turned slowly to look at his new son-in-law. His face was a mask of cold fury. "You used my name and my daughter's trust to commit federal wire fraud," he growled, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. Derek was shaking visibly. He looked frantically at the sea of disgusted faces surrounding him. He looked at his mother, who was now crying hysterically into her hands. He looked at his father, who was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Finally, Derek looked at me. His fear instantly mutated into desperate, unhinged rage. "It's a lie," Derek screamed, pointing a trembling finger in my face. "She is a jealous, psychotic liar. She fabricated all of this because she hates me. That federal notice is fake. Those transfer logs are fake. It's a complete forgery. She printed it in her office to ruin my wedding day. You have to believe me, Sam. It's a forgery." He was practically hyperventilating, his custom tuxedo now soaked with nervous sweat. He slammed his hand onto the head table, making the expensive crystal champagne flutes rattle. "Somebody call the cops," he yelled desperately, trying to regain control of the narrative. "It's a forgery. Arrest her for trespassing. Get her out of my wedding right now." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply let him exhaust his frantic energy while the entire ballroom watched him unravel. When he finally stopped screaming, he stood there panting, waiting for anyone to take his side. No one moved to help him. The silence was absolute and completely deafening. I smiled warmly at my brother, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace wash over me. I slowly raised my hand and pointed past him, toward the massive wooden doors at the far end of the ballroom. "If you really think this is a forgery, Derek," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room, "then you should probably tell that directly to the authorities. Because I doubt the FBI task force walking through that door is a forgery." 2. Every head in the ballroom whipped around toward the grand wooden doors at the far end of the conservatory. 2 men and 1 woman, dressed in sharp dark suits, strode into the room. They didn't look like wedding guests. They moved with stiff, purposeful authority, completely ignoring the beautiful floral arrangements and the bewildered stares of the high society crowd. One of the men held up a leather badge wallet, flashing a silver shield. The music had stopped a long time ago, but now even the whispers died. The silence was so absolute that the synchronized click of the agent's shoes on the marble floor sounded like gunshots. Derek gripped the edge of the head table, his knuckles turning stark white. His jaw dropped as he watched the agents march straight down the center aisle. He looked like a man standing on the tracks, watching a freight train barrel toward him. He spun around wildly, looking for anyone to save him. He locked eyes with my father. "Dad, do something," Derek pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "Tell them it's a mistake. Call our lawyers." Richard finally snapped out of his shock. His face turned a deep, violent shade of purple. Instead of looking at the federal agents, he turned all his wrath directly on me. He marched across the dance floor, closing the distance until he was inches from my face. "You did this," Richard roared. Spit flying from his lips. "You called them here to ruin your brother's life. You vindictive brat." I stood my ground, not moving an inch. "I didn't have to call them, Richard," I replied calmly. "When you default on $100 million in federal loans, and then try to wire $50 million of fraudulent funds to the Cayman Islands, the banking algorithms notify the authorities automatically. All I did was stop protecting him." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You think you're so smart, Catherine," he spat, jabbing a thick finger into my shoulder. "But you just destroyed yourself, too. You are a founding partner of the family real estate firm. Your name is on the original incorporation documents. If Derek goes down for corporate fraud, and the bank seizes the company assets, you are going down with us. You are legally responsible for a third of that debt. You just called the feds on your own bank account." Derek heard this, and a sick, desperate smile crept onto his sweaty face. "He's right," Catherine Derek yelled, pointing at me from behind the table. "We are a family business. If I'm guilty of wire fraud, the board of directors is complicit. You are on the board. You are going to federal prison right alongside me." I looked at my brother and my father, watching them desperately try to drag me down onto their sinking ship. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they had completely forgotten what happened less than 5 minutes ago. I reached into my designer bag and slowly pulled out the thick, folded parchment paper. The black ribbon hung loosely from my fingers. I held the document up high so the federal agents, who were now approaching the front of the room, could see it clearly. "Actually, Richard," I said, my voice echoing clean across the massive room, "I am no longer on the board of directors. And I am not a legal member of this family." Richard's aggressive posture faltered. He stared at the parchment paper in my hand, a look of dawning horror slowly creeping across his face. "This notarized document, which you and Beatrice just handed me in front of 500 witnesses, formally severs my legal ties to the family trust," I explained, pronouncing every word with crystal clear precision. "You legally declared Derek the sole heir and sole operator of the entire empire. You explicitly removed my name from all shared assets and all corporate liabilities, officially disinheriting me and forcing me out of the company trust. You just legally absorbed 100% of the debt." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Beatrice, who was standing near the stage, shaking violently. "You thought you were punishing me," I continued, stepping closer to my father. "You thought you were throwing me out in the cold. But what you actually did was sign a legally binding confession that Derek is solely responsible for the fraud. You handed me the perfect legal shield. And you took the $100 million bullet all by yourselves." Beatrice let out a sharp gasp. Her eyes rolled back, and her knees completely buckled. She collapsed onto the marble floor in a heap of shimmering silver fabric. Several guests screamed and rushed forward to help her. But Richard was completely paralyzed. He stared at me, realizing that his cruel attempt to humiliate his daughter had just cost him his entire fortune and his freedom. Derek realized it, too. The agents were only 20 feet away. Now, Derek looked at Samantha, who had backed away from him like he was a monster. He looked at the federal agents. Then, without warning, Derek turned and bolted. He scrambled over the head table, knocking the ice sculpture to the floor, and sprinted desperately toward the catering doors. Derek didn't make it more than 20 feet. He was fast, but his panic made him clumsy as he launched himself toward the metal kitchen doors. A massive figure stepped out from the shadows and blocked his path completely. It was Judge Sterling. For a retired man, pushing 70. The judge moved with terrifying speed and precision. He planted his feet firmly on the marble floor and stood tall, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He looked like a solid brick wall wrapped in a tailored charcoal suit. Derek slammed on the brakes, his designer shoes skidding across the polished floor. "Get out of my way," Derek screamed wildly, waving his hands. "Let me past, I have to get out of here." Judge Sterling didn't move an inch. He reached out and grabbed Derek by the lapels of his custom tuxedo, lifting him slightly on his toes. "You aren't going anywhere." "Son?" Judge Sterling growled, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You are going to stand right here and face the consequences of your actions like a man." Derek struggled against the older man's iron grip, but it was useless. "Please." Derek Bagel, his arrogant facade completely shattered. "You have to let me go. I have the $50 million. I can fix this. I can pay the private lenders and make everything right. Just let me get to my car." Judge Sterling let out a short, humorless laugh. He leaned in, so his face was inches from Derek's sweaty forehead. "Do you really think you have my $50 million?" the judge asked, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. "I spent 30 years presiding over federal fraud cases. Derek. I know a con artist when I see one. I just wanted to believe the best for my daughter's sake. But the second Catherine mentioned a commercial expansion to me before the ceremony, my instincts kicked in. I am not a fool." Derek's eyes widened in horror as the judge's words sank in. "What are you talking about?" Derek whispered. "I called my contacts at the Federal Reserve the moment the string quartet started playing." Judge Sterling explained, his voice echoing clearly across the silent ballroom. "I asked them to run an emergency check on the routing numbers you provided for your corporate accounts. They flagged the offshore wire transfer immediately. That $50 million bridge loan never made it to the Cayman Islands. I froze the funds 30 minutes before you even said your vows. Your accounts are completely empty. Derek. You didn't get a single red cent of my family's money." Derek's entire body went limp. The desperate hope that he could somehow buy his way out of this nightmare evaporated instantly. He had risked federal wire fraud charges to steal $50 million. And he had absolutely nothing to show for it. His golden empire was nothing but dust. I watched from my table, savoring the absolute destruction of his ego. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. Samantha walked slowly across the dance floor, her beautiful white silk dress trailing behind her. She stopped right next to her father. She didn't look at Derek with sadness or pity. She looked at him with absolute, icy disgust. "Samantha. Honey." Derek pleaded, his voice cracking as tears finally spilled down his cheeks. "Please. I did this for us. I wanted to give you the life you deserve. I was going to fix the business and make us billionaires." Samantha didn't say a single word in response to his pathetic lies. She raised her left hand and looked down at the massive diamond engagement ring, glittering under the crystal chandeliers. She had thought it was a symbol of love and devotion. Now she knew it was just another piece of stolen collateral, secured by fraud. She reached over, pinched the diamond, and slid the heavy platinum band off her finger. Derek watched her in total panic. "Sam." "No." He bagel. Shaking his head rapidly, Samantha walked over to the nearest guest table. A half-full glass of expensive champagne sat near the edge. She held the $500,000 ring over the glass and dropped it. It hit the golden liquid with a soft, hollow clink, sinking straight to the bottom. "We are getting an annulment tomorrow morning," Samantha said, her voice as cold as ice. "Never contact me or my family again." Before Derek could even process his bride's final words, the three plainclothes federal agents arrived. The lead agent grabbed Derek's shoulder and spun him around violently, pinning his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the massive conservatory as they were locked tightly around Derek's wrists. Derek groaned in pain, his face pressed awkwardly against the federal agent's shoulder. He was completely trapped. The high society guests stood in absolute silence, watching the golden boy of the family empire get hauled away in chains. The illusion was finally over. 24 hours later, the intoxicating scent of imported orchids and expensive champagne had been entirely replaced by the sharp, sterile odor of industrial bleach. I sat alone in a small, windowless interrogation room inside the federal detention facility in downtown New York. The hum of the overhead fluorescent lights was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. I checked my watch. It was exactly 2:00 p.m. At this exact moment, yesterday, Derek was cutting a 10-tier wedding cake. Today, he was waiting for a bail hearing in a federal holding center. The heavy steel door clicked loudly and swung open. A federal guard escorted my brother into the room. Derek looked completely foreign. His custom-tailored tuxedo had been replaced by a standard gray cotton jumpsuit. His perfect hair was a mess, and dark purple bags hung heavily beneath his bloodshot eyes. But despite having spent his wedding night on a thin mattress in a concrete cell, the sheer arrogance radiating from him hadn't diminished in the slightest. He sat down heavily in the cold metal chair across from me, leaning back as if we were in a corporate boardroom instead of a federal prison. He didn't say thank you for coming. He didn't apologize for the humiliating spectacle he caused. He just stared at me with absolute expectation. "It's about time you showed up," Derek snapped aggressively, tapping his fingers against the cold metal table. "I've been telling these idiot guards since midnight that my sister runs a massive hedge fund. I need you to wire the bail money immediately. The judge set it at $2 million this morning. That's pocket change for your firm. And I need you to retain the best white-collar defense attorney in New York. Don't get anyone local. I need a legal shark who can crush this absurd wire fraud charge before it permanently damages my corporate reputation." I sat perfectly still, resting my hands calmly in my lap. I watched him barking orders as if I were his personal assistant. He was completely disconnected from the catastrophic reality he had created. "Your reputation?" I asked, my voice echoing flatly off the painted cinderblock walls. "Derek, your reputation is completely destroyed." Samantha filed for a legal annulment at 9:00 a.m. Her father handed a mountain of evidence against you to the federal prosecutors. The bank seized the family real estate office at dawn, locking all the employees out. There is no reputation left to protect. You are a federal criminal facing a decade in prison. Derek waved his hand dismissively, scoffing at my words as if I were exaggerating over a minor accounting error. "That's just temporary noise," he insisted, his eyes wild with desperate delusion. "Sam will calm down once I have a chance to explain the situation to her in private. The business can be restructured. I just need to get back to my office and move some assets around. But I can't do any of that from inside this cage. Catherine, I need you to write the check right now." I stared at him, marveling at his absolute blindness. "Why on earth would you think I am going to pay your bail?" I asked softly. "Because I'm still your blood," Derek demanded, slamming his palm against the metal table. "You proved your point yesterday. You embarrassed Mom and Dad. You proved you're the smartest person in the room. Fine. You won. But the game is over now. You can't just leave me in here with these criminals. I'm your brother. We share the same last name. Family protects family. Catherine, you have to get me out of here." I tilted my head, studying the desperate panic, finally bleeding through his arrogant mask. Did you forget what happened at your beautiful reception? Derek, I replied, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. Our parents publicly handed me a notarized document, removing my name from the family trust. You signed it yourself. You legally declared that I am no longer your family. You severed our blood ties completely, just so you could keep 100% of the business and the debt. I do not share your last name. And I certainly do not owe you $2 million. Derek's face fell. The reality of the disinheritance letter finally hit him. But you have the money, he whispered, his voice cracking. You're the only one who can save me. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. I didn't pull out a checkbook or a legal proxy. I slowly slid the $400,000 catering bill from the rehearsal dinner across the scratched metal table. I paid for the lobster, I said, looking him dead in the eye. The lawyer is on you. I left the detention facility immediately after my visit with Derek. By Monday morning, I was back in my element. My penthouse office in Manhattan was a fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass and polished mahogany, overlooking the entire city. It was a world I had built with my own hands. Completely free from the toxic swamp of my family. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the final asset transfer documents from the Hamptons estate, when the heavy oak doors to my suite burst open. My executive assistant stumbled backward, trying to block the door. I'm so sorry, Ms. Catherine, she stammered, looking terrified. They pushed past lobby security. They claimed it was a life-or-death family emergency. I looked up from my papers. Standing in the doorway were Beatrice and Richard. They looked absolutely unrecognizable. The Hamptons aristocrats had completely vanished. Beatrice was wearing the same wrinkled clothes from the wedding reception, and her expensive silver hair was matted. Richard looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His posture was slumped. His tuxedo shirt was stained, and his face was pale with sheer terror. I waved my hand, signaling for my assistant to step away and close the door. As soon as the heavy door clicked shut, Beatrice launched into her theatrical routine. She threw herself into one of the expensive leather guest chairs, sobbing uncontrollably. You set us up, she wailed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. You orchestrated all of this to destroy us. We went back to the Hamptons last night, and there were federal marshals on the lawn. There are heavy chains and padlocks on our front gates. Catherine. They taped seizure notices to the front door. We can't even get inside to get our clothes or my jewelry. You knew this was going to happen, and you let us walk right into a trap. I slowly closed the file folder on my desk and leaned back in my chair. I didn't set you up, Beatrice, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I just stopped being your human financial shield. You and Richard built this trap yourselves. Brick by brick. Did you think I didn't know what was happening all those years I watched you co-sign his fraudulent loans when he was 25? I watched you empty my college savings account to cover his first major embezzlement scandal. You treated me like a bank while treating Derek like a god. You fed his delusions because you wanted the prestige of having a billionaire son without putting in the actual work. He's your brother, Richard whispered, his voice barely a rasp. We were trying to protect him. We thought the judge's bridge loan would solve everything. We didn't know the federal government was already investigating the old debts. Ignorance is not a legal defense, Richard, I replied sharply, standing up from my desk. You were co-founders of the company. You signed the tax returns when he bought that yacht 3 years ago. You knew the business was operating at a massive loss. You deliberately turned a blind eye because he bought you expensive jewelry and luxury vacations with stolen money. And when the walls finally started closing in, your brilliant solution was to extort your own daughter. You tried to force me to sign over my equity so I would take the fall. You were perfectly willing to let me go to federal prison so your golden boy could keep playing make-believe. Beatrice cried harder, hiding her face in her hands. We were desperate. Catherine. She sobbed, her voice breaking. We made a mistake. We are your parents. You can't just leave us on the street. We have no money. Our accounts are completely frozen. We had to sleep in a rental car last night. You have the clothes on your backs and each other, I said, walking over to the massive glass window. That's far more than you ever gave me. Richard took a step forward, his pride completely shattered. He dropped to his knees on my expensive wool rug. It was a pathetic sight. A man who had spent his entire life bullying me was now groveling at my feet. Please. Catherine. Richard begged, clasping his hands together. Forget the house. Forget the business. We just need a loan. A small loan. Derekisin a federalzel. His public defender is some kid fresh out of law school. We need to hire a real defense attorney for him. Just lend us $200. Ling ling ling. You make that in a week. Please. He won't survive in federal prison. I looked down at my father, kneeling on the floor, begging for the son who had ruined them. I felt not an ounce of pity. I walked back to my desk and looked at the intercom panel. Without breaking eye contact with Richard, I reached out and firmly pressed the silver button on my desk. Within seconds, the heavy oak doors to my office swung open again. Two of my private security guards stepped into the room. They were massive men in tailored black suits, moving with quiet, professional efficiency. They looked at Richard kneeling on the floor and stepped forward to physically remove him. Hold on, I ordered, raising my hand. The guards stopped instantly, crossing their arms and standing by the door like stone statues. I wanted my parents out, but I wasn't finished with them yet. I walked around my massive mahogany desk, my high heels sinking slightly into the expensive wool rug. I stood looking down at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. Richard was still on his knees looking up at me with pathetic, desperate eyes. Beatrice was huddled in the leather guest chair, her face streaked with ruined makeup. They thought this was the end of the line. They thought the worst thing I had done was call the authorities on their golden boy. They still didn't understand the true scale of what had actually happened over the weekend. I walked over to a small side table and picked up a thick black binder. I dropped it onto the glass coffee table right in front of my father. What is this? Richard asked, his voice shaking as he stared at the heavy binder. Go ahead and open it, I offered, crossing my arms. He reached out with trembling hands and flipped open the heavy plastic cover. His bloodshot eyes scanned the first page, and his jaw dropped. Beatrice leaned forward, peering over his shoulder. The documents inside weren't federal indictments or police reports. They were corporate acquisition records. You see, Richard, I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. I didn't just call the authorities to report Derek. That would have been too easy. I'm a hedge fund manager. My debt purchasing firm specializes in acquiring toxic corporate liabilities. 3 months ago, when the private lenders realized Derek was never going to pay them back, they auctioned off his $100 million debt for pennies on the dollar. I bought it. All of it. My firm had quietly acquired every single piece of paper, tying their family to that failing company. Richard stared at the paperwork, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. I bought the defaulted loans from the family business. I continued, stepping closer to him so he could hear every syllable clearly. Every contract, every mortgage, and every credit line your golden boy signed. I didn't just expose his fraud. I bought it. I am now your sole creditor. When the federal bank froze Derek's accounts on Saturday, they were acting under my legal authority. I own the commercial properties. I own his luxury cars. I even own the rights to Derek's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. You don't owe the bank, Richard. You owe me. Beatrice let out a choked gasp, clutching her chest as if she couldn't breathe. But we are your parents, she whispered, her voice completely hollow. You can't take our house. Catherine. We built that house. We raised you in that house. You can't just throw your own mother and father out on the street. It's completely inhumane. I shook my head, my expression completely cold. You raised a scapegoat in that house, Beatrice. I corrected her. You raised a human punching bag to make yourselves feel powerful. You were perfectly willing to let me take the fall for federal wire fraud so your favorite son could keep living a lie. But you aren't powerful anymore. The family real estate empire doesn't belong to Derek. It belongs to me. And as of this morning, I officially began the liquidation process. The Hamptons mansion is being seized to cover the interest payments you missed. Richard slumped backward, sitting on his heels, completely defeated. The aggressive, arrogant father, who had threatened to destroy me just 48 hours ago, was gone. He was nothing but a broken, bankrupt old man, staring up at the daughter he had thrown away. Beatrice finally realized the absolute reality of their situation. The disinheritance letter they had proudly handed me at the wedding wasn't just a shield. It was a sword I used to sever myself from their sinking ship while simultaneously taking total control of their lives. Her legs gave out completely. She slid out of the leather chair and fell to her knees on the floor next to her husband. She knelt there, staring up at the daughter she had always treated like garbage, finally understanding that the scapegoat was now the undisputed master of their entire existence. 3 days after the wedding that never really happened, my private business line rang. My assistant informed me that a guest was waiting in the lobby and specifically requested a brief meeting. I checked my security cameras on the monitor. It was Samantha. She wasn't wearing the stunning white silk dress anymore. Instead, she wore a sharp navy blazer and dark trousers, looking every bit the Boston heiress she was raised to be. I told my assistant to let her in, and poured 2 cups of black coffee. When Samantha walked into my penthouse office, she took a moment to look around. She took in the massive mahogany desk, the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, and the sleek, professional atmosphere. She looked tired, but there was a quiet strength radiating from her. We had only ever spoken at tense dinner tables surrounded by my toxic family. Now, alone in my territory, the dynamic was completely different. I appreciate you making time for me, Catherine, Samantha said, taking a seat in the leather guest chair across from my desk. I know you're busy dismantling what's left of Derek's empire. I handed her a cup of coffee and sat down. It wasn't an empire, Samantha, I corrected gently. It was a house of cards. And you don't need to apologize for coming here. I imagine the last few days have been a nightmare for you. Samantha took a slow sip of her coffee, holding the warm mug with both hands. My father finalized the annulment papers yesterday, she said, her voice steady but laced with lingering disbelief. I spent the entire morning looking over the financial disclosures Derek submitted when we signed our prenup. Every single page was a complete fabrication. He forged bank statements, tax returns, and property deeds. I feel incredibly stupid for believing him. You aren't stupid, I replied, leaning forward. Derek is a professional con artist. He was raised by two people who spent 30 years teaching him how to manipulate the truth and hide his failures. He targeted you because you were smart, wealthy, and completely unaware of his history. Samantha sighed heavily, setting her cup on the glass desk. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. My father and I hired a forensic accountant to trace the exact root of that $50 million bridge loan. I wanted to know exactly what Derek planned to do with my family's money. I already know what he was planning, I said, crossing my arms. He was going to route the $50 million through a holding company in the Caymans to wash the trail. Then he would use those funds to pay off the most aggressive private lenders he owed. Once the pressure was off, he would have convinced you to merge your personal trust fund with his corporate accounts to finance his next fake expansion. Within 5 years, your entire inheritance would have been drained to keep his sinking ship afloat. Samantha stared at me, her dark eyes wide with terrifying realization. Our accountant said the exact same thing. She whispered. He was going to use my family as his personal ATM until there was nothing left. If you hadn't spoken to my father before the ceremony, I would be legally tied to $50 million in federal debt right now. You saved my life, Catherine. I didn't do it to be a hero. Samantha. I admitted honestly. I did it because my parents tried to throw me under the bus to save him. But I'm glad you got out before the trap snapped shut. You deserve much better than my brother. Samantha smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. She reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a sleek silver folder. She slid it across my desk, right next to my coffee cup. My father is a very powerful man in Boston, Samantha said, her tone shifting from victim to sharp businesswoman. He sits on the board of directors for 3 major private equity groups. He told his colleagues exactly what happened over the weekend. He told them how you single-handedly exposed a massive federal wire fraud scheme and legally acquired the defaulted assets without breaking a single compliance law. I looked down at the silver folder, and then back up at Samantha. And what exactly did his colleagues have to say about that? I asked. My curiosity piqued. They said you are exactly the kind of ruthless, intelligent financial manager they want handling their money, Samantha replied, leaning back in her chair. That folder contains the preliminary paperwork for an exclusive partnership. The Sterling family and our associated investment groups want your hedge fund to manage our primary portfolios. It's an initial transfer of $500 million in capital. I stared at the folder, the magnitude of the offer sinking in. My family had tried to destroy me to steal $50 million. Now, the very people they tried to defraud were handing me 10 times that amount, simply because I had the integrity to burn the liars to the ground. The liquidation process was swift and utterly merciless. I didn't rely on standard collection agencies. I deployed my firm's elite team of corporate auditors and asset recovery specialists directly to the Hamptons. 2 days after my parents stormed my New York office, I stood on the manicured lawn of the sprawling estate I used to call home. A fleet of heavy white moving trucks was parked along the circular driveway. The massive iron gates, which usually kept the world out, were thrown wide open. Men in heavy boots were systematically emptying the house, carrying out leather sofas, expensive antique tables, and crystal chandeliers. I stood near the front portico, holding a digital tablet that listed every single valuable item belonging to the family firm. My lead auditor, a sharp man named Evans, walked out the front door, holding a small velvet box. He looked frustrated. Ms. Catherine, Evans said, handing me the box. We have a problem with the inventory list. I opened the box. It was empty. This was supposed to hold the sapphire necklace my mother bought last year, I noted. tapping my tablet screen. "Where is it?" "That's exactly the problem," Evans replied, shaking his head. "Several high-value portable items are missing from the master bedroom. The sapphire necklace, 3 Rolex watches, and a rare silver coin collection. We swept the wall safe, but it was completely empty." I looked up at the second-floor windows. My parents were still inside the house. I had allowed them a few hours to pack 2 suitcases of personal clothing before the marshals officially padlocked the doors. They were supposed to be grabbing the basics, not looting corporate collateral. I handed the empty box back to Evans and walked briskly through the grand foyer. The house looked entirely different, stripped of its expensive furnishings. The echo of my heels against the bare hardwood floors sounded hollow. I climbed the grand staircase and walked straight to the master suite. I didn't knock. I pushed open the heavy wooden door. Richard was kneeling on the floor, frantically stuffing something into a battered leather duffel bag. Beatrice was standing near the closet, wringing her hands nervously. When the door swung open, Richard jumped, trying to kick the bag under the bed. He looked like a cornered rat. "What are you doing, Richard?" I asked, stepping into the room. "Just packing my socks," Richard stammered, a nervous sweat breaking out on his forehead. "You said we could take 2 bags. I'm just getting my socks." I walked over to the bed and yanked the heavy leather bag out from under the frame. I unzipped it. It wasn't full of socks. It was crammed with the missing Rolex watches, the sapphire necklace, the silver coins, and several stacks of $100 bills rubber-banded together. I let out a slow, disappointed breath. "You really aren't very good at this, Richard," I said, looking down at him. "When a federal bankruptcy proceeding is initiated, trying to hide physical assets is a felony. It's called fraudulent transfer. You are already facing conspiracy charges regarding Derek's wire fraud. Do you really want to add concealment of assets to your federal indictment?" Beatrice burst into fresh tears, rushing forward to grab my arm. "Please, Catherine," she cried. "We just need something to sell. We have absolutely no money to survive. You can't leave us with nothing." I pulled my arm out of her grip. I picked up the leather bag and handed it directly to one of my auditors who had followed me upstairs. "Log everything in this bag," I instructed clearly, "and notify the federal marshals that Richard attempted to conceal collateral. They can add it to his file." Richard slumped against the wall, completely defeated. He didn't even try to argue. I walked out of the master bedroom, leaving them to face the consequences of their greed. I wandered down the hallway toward the back of the house. I stopped in front of the door to my old childhood bedroom. It was the small, pale blue room where Beatrice had forced me to sleep. The movers had already cleared out the bed and the dresser. The room was completely empty, except for a small pile of trash swept into the center of the floor. I walked over to the pile. Sticking out from under a discarded cardboard box was a small notebook with a faded green cover. I picked it up. It was my old childhood diary. I had hidden it under a loose floorboard when I was 14. Beatrice must have found it while tearing the house apart looking for valuables, and simply threw it in the trash when she realized it had no monetary value. I flipped through the pages, reading the desperate entries of a little girl begging for her parents' love. The words were full of pain and confusion. I stared at the faded ink, realizing just how long I had been carrying that heavy burden. I walked out of the room and carried the diary downstairs to the main living room. The massive stone fireplace was completely empty. I tossed the diary onto the cold stone hearth. I struck a match and dropped it onto the faded green cover. I stood there and watched the pages curl and burn, turning my painful history into nothing but gray ash. The scapegoat was finally dead. I walked out of the empty Hamptons mansion, leaving the ashes of my past in the cold stone fireplace. The drive back to New York City felt like crossing a finish line. Over the next week, my firm aggressively processed the seized assets. The commercial properties were swiftly auctioned off to developers eager to bulldoze my brother's failed projects. The luxury vehicles, including the custom sports cars Derek used to parade around in, were liquidated to cover outstanding legal fees. I was sitting at my desk on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, reviewing the final foreclosure documents, when my private line rang. The caller ID displayed an unknown area code from Washington, D.C. I picked up the receiver, keeping my eyes on my computer screen. "This is Catherine," I answered, my voice crisp and professional. "Ms. Catherine. My name is David. I am the federal public defender assigned to represent your brother, Derek." I leaned back in my leather chair, picking up a heavy silver pen. "I'm surprised you have time to make personal calls, David," I replied. I imagine defending a man caught red-handed committing federal wire fraud is quite a time-consuming task, especially considering the mountain of evidence the prosecution holds. David let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. The audio quality was slightly muffled, as if he were calling from a crowded courthouse hallway. "It is an incredibly difficult case, Ms. Catherine," he admitted, sounding genuinely defeated. "The federal prosecutors have an airtight timeline of the fraudulent transfers." Judge Sterling handed them the bank records on a silver platter. "Derek is currently facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 8 years in a federal penitentiary. He is in solitary confinement for his own protection, and his mental state is deteriorating rapidly. I fail to see how his sentencing guidelines or his mental state are my concern, David," I said calmly, resting my elbows on my mahogany desk. "I am not his legal guardian. In fact, legally speaking, I am not even his sister anymore." "I know about the disinheritance letter," David replied quickly, "but I'm calling because you are the primary creditor holding the defaulted corporate loans." "Go on, Ms. Catherine." "The civil suits your firm has filed are aggravating his criminal liability. The prosecutors are using your civil claims to establish maximum financial harm. If you maintain the asset forfeiture suits, the judge will view his crimes in their absolute worst light. But if you withdraw the civil claims and agree to a private restructuring plan, we can show the court that the victims are willing to cooperate. It could shave 3 or 4 years off his sentence. I am begging you to show him some leniency. He is completely terrified." I stopped spinning the silver pen and set it down on the desk. "You want me to drop a $100 million civil suit so your client can get a lighter sentence?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want my firm to absorb his massive debt just so he can spend a little less time wearing a gray jumpsuit? He is a broken man, Ms. Catherine," David pleaded. "He made a terrible mistake, but a decade in federal prison will completely destroy whatever is left of his life. He has no assets left. Your firm already took the Hamptons house and the entire real estate business. You won the war. Please. You have the power to show a little humanity here. Give him a chance to rebuild himself one day." I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain beat against the glass of my corner office. "Humanity," I echoed, a cold, sharp laugh escaping my lips. "Let me tell you a story about my brother's humanity, David. When I was 22, I worked 3 different jobs just to pay the interest on the student loans my parents forced me to take out. Those loans were used to buy a brand new sports car for Derek to celebrate his college graduation. One night, I was so exhausted from working a double shift that I passed out on the kitchen floor. Derek stepped over me on his way to a luxury nightclub. David remained completely silent on the other end of the line. I asked him for help that night. I continued, my voice hard and unforgiving. I begged him to sell the sports car so I could pay my tuition and actually graduate. Do you know what my brother told me? David. He looked down at me with a sneer and said, the market doesn't care about your feelings. Catherine. If you can't pay to play, you deserve to lose. I took a deep breath, letting the painful memory wash away. So you can tell my brother that I am just following his brilliant financial advice, I said, gripping the phone tightly. I am not dropping the civil suits. I will pursue every single cent until he is legally bankrupt for the rest of his natural life. If he can't pay to play, he deserves to lose. There was a long, heavy pause on the line. I could hear the faint wail of police sirens in the background of David's call. I understand, David finally said, his voice completely devoid of hope. I had to ask. It is my job to explore every possible avenue for my client. But since you are officially refusing a settlement mitigation, I have to inform you of our alternative strategy. I frowned, turning away from the rain-slicked window. What alternative strategy? Derek is desperate. Ms. Catherine. David explained, his voice dropping to a low, confidential whisper. If he can't get leniency through a civil settlement, he has to get it by cooperating with federal prosecutors. He is officially flipping to become a state witness tomorrow morning. A witness against who? I asked, my eyes narrowing. Against the original co-founders of the corporation. David answered grimly. He signed a proffer agreement to testify that the entire wire fraud scheme wasn't his idea. He is going to swear, under oath, that Beatrice and Richard engineered the whole operation. He is throwing his parents under the bus to save himself. I let David's words hang in the heavy air of my office. He was throwing my parents under the bus. The golden boy, the kid who could do no wrong, was preparing to sit in a federal courtroom and swear under oath that Beatrice and Richard were the true masterminds behind the wire fraud. It was a spectacular level of betrayal, a thief turning on the very people who spent 3 decades teaching him how to steal. I thanked David for his time and placed the receiver gently back onto the phone base. A cold, satisfying smile spread across my face. The snake was finally eating its own tail. It didn't take long for the legal fallout to reach the cheap rental apartment my parents had been forced to move into. Exactly 2 days after my conversation with the public defender, my personal cell phone started buzzing on my glass coffee table. I was sitting on my velvet sofa, reading a quarterly earnings report. The caller ID displayed Beatrice's number. I had ignored her previous calls since the eviction, but this one I had to answer. I swiped the screen and held the phone to my ear. I didn't even get the chance to say a polite hello. Catherine. Beatrice screamed into the phone. Her voice was unrecognizable, totally stripped of its usual arrogant polish. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure panic. They subpoenaed us. Federal marshals just knocked on our door and handed us subpoenas. We have to appear before a grand jury on Friday morning. They are going to indict us. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. I'm aware, Beatrice, I replied smoothly, not bothering to hide the calm satisfaction in my voice. Federal prosecutors are building a massive corporate racketeering case. When the prime suspect signs a proffer agreement, the co-conspirators are always the next dominoes to fall. He lied to them, Beatrice sobbed, hyperventilating wildly. We read the summary of his statement attached to the subpoena. Derek told the federal prosecutors that his father and I forced him to take out those fraudulent loans. He said we manipulated the corporate ledgers and threatened to cut him out of the business if he didn't wire the money to the Cayman Islands. He is framing us. Catherine. His own parents. He is trying to send us to federal prison so he can get a reduced sentence. She broke down into loud, ugly tears, coughing and gasping for air. How could he do this to us? She wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of the ultimate betrayal. We gave him everything. We sacrificed our entire lives to make sure he was successful. We protected him from every consequence. And he just stabbed us in the back without a second thought. He is a sociopath. He is a monster. I listened to her cry without feeling absolutely any sympathy for the woman who spent my entire childhood treating me like an unwanted burden. You built the monster, Beatrice, I said, my voice dropping to an icy, unforgiving whisper. You fed his ego. You covered up his mistakes. You taught him that the rules didn't apply to him as long as he had the right last name. You raised a man who values absolutely nothing but himself. And now you have to live with him. Or rather, you get to share a cell block with him. The line went dead silent for a long moment, except for the sound of Beatrice's ragged breathing. When she finally spoke again, the desperate crying had completely vanished. In its place was the cold, vindictive venom I had known my entire life. She was legally cornered. And she was ready to lash out at the only target she had left. You think this is funny, Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated malice. You think you can just sit in your glass tower and watch us burn? You engineered this entire tragedy. Catherine, you bought the debt. You humiliated us at the wedding. You cornered Derek until he had absolutely no choice but to turn on us to survive. I didn't force Derek to commit federal wire fraud, I reminded her sharply, my patience wearing thin. I just stopped paying for the cleanup. Nobody cares about the truth, Beatrice spat, her voice rising into a frantic shriek. They care about a good story. And I am going to give them one. If you don't call your lawyers right now and drop the civil suits against our estate. I am calling the press. I have the private number for the lead investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I will tell them exactly how the ruthless hedge fund manager orchestrated the complete destruction of her own family, out of pure spite and childish jealousy. I will tell the world you planted the financial evidence to steal the family business. I will destroy your corporate reputation. Catherine, I will drag you down into the mud with us. I let Beatrice scream her threats until she finally ran out of breath. You are going to regret this. Catherine, she panted, her voice hoarse. I'm calling the paper right now. I'm going to make sure everyone in the financial sector knows exactly what kind of monster you really are. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue with her. I simply smiled a cold, sharp smile. Go ahead, Beatrice, I told her calmly. Call the papers. Tell them whatever story you want. I guarantee they will be much more interested in the story I am about to tell them. I ended the call and tossed my cell phone onto the glass table. Beatrice thought she held the ultimate leverage by threatening public humiliation. She was still operating under the delusion that I cared about the polished facade of Hampton's high society. But I operated in the cutthroat world of Wall Street finance, where perception is reality. And whoever controls the narrative controls the market. I picked up the desk phone and pressed the button for my director of public relations. Book the main press room on the ground floor, I instructed as soon as he answered. Invite every major financial reporter in the city. Tell them my firm is holding an emergency press conference regarding a major acquisition and the successful dismantling of a $100 million corporate wire fraud ring. Have it ready in 2 hours. 2 hours later, I stood at a sleek glass podium, facing a packed room of journalists, flashing cameras, and recording television crews. I wore a sharp black suit, my posture perfectly straight, projecting absolute authority. I looked out at the sea of reporters, feeling completely in my element. This was my world. Not Beatrice's. Good afternoon. I began, my voice projecting clearly through the microphone. I called this press conference today to announce a significant victory for our firm. And a major win for corporate transparency. Over the past 3 months, my team has quietly acquired a massive portfolio of defaulted commercial debt, previously held by various private lenders. Today, I can confirm that these loans were tied to a sophisticated Ponzi scheme operating under the guise of a prominent real estate firm. Reporters began scribbling furiously on their notepads. We successfully acquired the debt, forced the defaulting company into liquidation, and coordinated with federal authorities to ensure the immediate arrest of the primary operator. I continued, maintaining a steady, professionnel cadence. Our firm takes corporate fraud incredibly seriously. We don't just buy debt, we clean up toxic liabilities and hold operators accountable to the fullest extent of the law. A tall reporter from the Financial Times raised his hand, practically jumping out of his chair. Ms. Catherine, he called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. Our sources indicate that the primary operator arrested over the weekend was Derek, and the real estate firm in question is owned by Richard and Beatrice. Are you confirming that your firm aggressively targeted and liquidated a company owned by your own parents and brother? The room fell completely silent. This was the trap Beatrice was banking on. She wanted the press to paint me as a vindictive daughter, destroying her own flesh and blood out of petty jealousy. The camera zoomed in on my face, waiting for a moment of hesitation or defensive panic. I didn't hesitate. I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out the thick, folded parchment paper. I unfolded it carefully, placing it flat on the glass podium right next to the microphone. I can confirm that the individuals you named were arrested for federal wire fraud, I replied, my voice ringing with absolute conviction. However, I must correct your assumption regarding my relationship with those individuals. I am not legally related to them. I held up the parchment paper, displaying it, so the cameras could clearly capture the dark blue ink and the notary's seal. This is a formal, notarized letter of disinheritance, I explained, projecting my voice across the quiet room. It was legally executed and publicly presented to me by Richard, Beatrice, and Derek prior to their arrest. They formally severed all legal ties, removed my name from their trusts, and explicitly declared that I am not a member of their family. The reporters stared in absolute shock. Camera shutters began clicking frantically, a rapid-fire symphony of breaking news. I did not target my family, I continued, placing the document back on the podium. I targeted a corrupt organization that was defrauding private investors and attempting to steal $50 million from an innocent family in Boston. The fact that the perpetrators used to share my last name did not grant them immunity from the law or the consequences of their financial crimes. My firm operates with absolute integrity. We don't protect criminals, we liquidate them. The press room erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions over one another, trying to get more details on the disinheritance letter and the offshore wire transfers. I answered a few more technical questions, maintaining my cool, professional composure, before stepping away from the podium and letting my PR director handle the frenzy. When I took the private elevator back to my penthouse office, the news was already breaking on every major financial network. The narrative was completely sealed. Beatrice could call whoever she wanted, but no one was going to listen to a desperate, indicted co-conspirator trying to smear the ruthless executive who took them down. I walked over to my desk and looked at the live market ticker on my computer monitor. Investors loved a CEO who valued profit and the law above toxic personal ties. Within 20 minutes of the press conference ending, My hedge fund's stock value shot up 12%. 6 months after the press conference that cemented my corporate legacy. I found myself sitting in the gallery of a federal courthouse. The transition from high finance in New York to the justice system was jarring, but necessary. I sat in the second row, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. To my right sat Samantha, looking flawless. Next to her sat Judge Sterling, projecting a quiet, imposing authority. We didn't speak. The gravity of the room demanded absolute silence. At the defense tables, the remnants of my former family were huddled with their respective legal teams. The contrast was striking. Derek wore an oversized orange jumpsuit, his wrists chained to a heavy chain around his waist. He had lost a significant amount of weight, and his hair was thinning rapidly. The golden boy of the Hamptons looked like a hollow shell of a human being. A few feet away at a separate table sat Beatrice and Richard. They wore cheap suits, completely stripped of their former high society glamour. Because Derek had become a state witness against them, they were legally required to maintain separate counsel. They hadn't spoken to their son in 6 months. The federal judge, Ostern, gray-haired woman, entered the courtroom and took her seat high above us all. She adjusted her reading glasses and picked up the thick sentencing report. The room collectively held its breath as she began to read the final judgments. She addressed Richard first, because he was a minor player, and because his financial ruin at my hands had already stripped him of all assets. The judge showed a tiny fraction of leniency. Richard was sentenced to 5 years of federal probation and ordered to perform 2,000 hours of community service. He slumped in his chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping silently. He was a broken man who would spend the rest of his life picking up trash. Then, the judge turned her attention to Derek. The silence in the gallery deepened. She recounted the magnitude of his financial crimes. She noted the $100 million in defaulted loans, and the brazen attempt to defraud a retired federal judge and his daughter. She specifically highlighted how Derek had cruelly tried to use his own family members as financial meat shields. Derek, you operated with a level of arrogance and deceit that is truly staggering, the federal judge stated, her voice echoing off the polished oak walls. You exploited every single person who ever trusted you. You believed your background and your connections elevated you above the law. Today, you will learn that they do not. For the charges of federal wire fraud and conspiracy, I sentence you to 8 years in a federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a loud crack that seemed to shake the floorboards. Suddenly, a sharp scream broke the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom. It was Beatrice. She jumped up from her chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. Her face was contorted in a mask of pure, uncontrolled hysteria. No skriket. Her voice cracking, as she pointed a trembling finger at the judge. You can't do this. He is a good boy, he made a mistake. It's her fault. She made him do it. Beatrice spun around and pointed wildly at me, sitting calmly in the gallery. She ruined us, Beatrice wailed, thrashing against her defense attorney who was desperately trying to pull her back down. She stole our money, she framed him. You are sending an innocent boy to prison while the real criminal is sitting right there. The judge slammed her gavel again, demanding order. 2 burly bailiffs rushed forward, grabbing Beatrice by the arms. She kicked and screamed, completely losing her mind in front of a gallery full of federal agents and reporters. Richard didn't even look up to help her. He just kept his face buried in his hands, completely defeated by the chaotic destruction of his own family. As Beatrice was dragged out of the courtroom, still screaming my name, another pair of bailiffs hauled Derek up from his chair. They turned him around to lead him toward the holding cells. As he shuffled down the center aisle, the heavy chains clinking against his ankles, he stopped. He turned his head and locked eyes with me. His gaze was full of terror, desperate, and a silent, agonizing plea for recognition. He wanted me to smile. He wanted me to gloat. I sat perfectly still. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I looked right through him. As if he were a complete stranger. As if he didn't exist. I walked out of the federal courthouse, leaving the chaotic echoes of my former family trapped behind its heavy mahogany doors. The crisp afternoon air felt remarkably clean. My private driver, Thomas, was waiting at the curb, standing next to my sleek black town car. He opened the rear door for me, and I slid into the quiet leather interior. Instead of directing him back to the private airstrip for my flight to New York, I handed him a piece of paper with a specific address. Thomas looked at the paper, his professional expression faltering for a fraction of a second. It was an address located on the absolute outskirts of Providence, far away from the manicured lawns and ocean views of the Hamptons. He nodded silently, putting the car into gear and pulling into the heavy city traffic. We drove for 45 minutes, watching the scenery slowly deteriorate. The glass skyscrapers and luxury boutiques gradually faded away, giving way to rusted chain-link fences, boarded-up storefronts, and crumbling asphalt. Finally, we pulled into the parking lot of a dilapidated apartment complex that bordered a rundown trailer park. The buildings were painted a faded yellow, and the gutters sagged under the weight of rotting leaves. I instructed Thomas to park across the street, under the shade of a large, dying oak tree. I kept the dark-tinted windows rolled up, letting the engine idle quietly. We sat in silence for 10 minutes before a beat-up, rusted sedan pulled into the complex parking lot. The passenger door creaked open, and Beatrice stepped out. I almost didn't recognize her. The woman who used to spend thousands of dollars a week on spa treatments and designer gowns was wearing faded sweatpants and an oversized, stained t-shirt. Her silver hair was tied up in a messy, uneven bun. She walked around to the trunk and struggled to lift several flimsy plastic bags filled with generic canned goods. A moment later, Richard emerged from the driver's side. He was wearing a bright orange reflective vest over a cheap flannel shirt, holding a metal trash picker tool. He had just returned from his court-ordered community service. He didn't even offer to help his wife with the heavy grocery bags. He just slammed his door and shuffled toward their ground-floor apartment with his head hung low in absolute defeat. Thomas watched the pathetic scene unfold through the windshield. He had been my driver for 5 years, and knew enough about my past to understand exactly who we were looking at. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes reflecting a quiet mixture of shock and pity. "Do you want me to pull closer, Ms. Catherine?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Perhaps you'd like to roll down the window and say something to them." I leaned back into the plush leather seat, crossing my legs comfortably. "No, Thomas," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I just wanted to see if the aesthetic suited them." Thomas frowned slightly, confused by the word. "The aesthetic," he echoed politely. "Yes," I continued, my gaze fixed on Beatrice as she fumbled with her keys, dropping a plastic bag onto the cracked concrete. "When I was 16, my mother threw a huge dinner party for the local real estate board. She hired a private chef and decorated the dining room with imported silk flowers. I had just gotten home from a double shift at my after-school job. I was exhausted and wearing a cheap uniform that smelled like grease. I tried to sit at the very end of the long dining table just to eat a small plate of leftover food. Beatrice marched over to me, grabbed me by the arm, and physically dragged me into the catering kitchen. She told me I was too ugly and too poor to be seen by her wealthy guests. She said my presence ruined the aesthetic of her perfect family. She forced me to eat my cold dinner standing up next to the industrial trash cans. While Derek sat at the head of the table laughing with millionaires, Thomas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as he listened to the story. I watched Beatrice bend down to pick up the cheap soup cans that had rolled across the dirty sidewalk. Her knees popped visibly, and she let out a heavy, exhausted sigh that I could practically feel from across the street. She looked incredibly old. She looked frail and entirely broken. A part of me expected to feel a sudden rush of vengeful joy. Another part of me wondered if I would feel a sudden pang of guilt, seeing the people who gave me life reduced to absolute poverty. But as I sat in the climate-controlled luxury of my car, watching them struggle, I realized the deepest truth of all. I felt absolutely nothing. The anger that had fueled my ambition for 33 years was completely gone. The desperate need for their validation had evaporated. They were just two strangers, struggling to survive in a mess of their own creation. Beatrice finally gathered her spilled groceries. As she stood up, she paused, wiping the sweat from her forehead. She looked across the street, directly at my idling car. She couldn't see through the heavy black tint, but she glared at the expensive vehicle with a look of bitter resentment. She hated whoever was sitting inside, simply because they had the wealth she had lost. I didn't roll down the window to gloat. I didn't step out to offer them a handful of cash. I owed them absolutely nothing. "Take us to the airport, Thomas," I said, pressing the button to ensure my window was locked tight against the outside world. "I have a business empire to run." Thomas nodded sharply, putting the car into drive. The tires pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the rusting trailer park behind in the rearview mirror. The cord was completely cut. The flight back to New York City was smooth and entirely uneventful. When I stepped out of the private elevator and into my penthouse office, the sun was just beginning to set over the Manhattan skyline. The sky was painted in brilliant strokes of orange and gold, casting a warm glow over the polished mahogany and glass of my sanctuary. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the decaying yellow walls of the trailer park I had left behind. I took off my tailored blazer and draped it over the back of my leather chair. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city that never sleeps. I had conquered my past, and now it was time to officially claim the spoils of that long, arduous victory. My lead legal assistant walked into the office carrying a thick stack of legal folders bound with heavy rubber bands. He placed them carefully in the center of my desk. "These are the final asset absorption contracts, Ms. Catherine," he announced, his voice filled with professional respect. "Everything has cleared the Federal Bankruptcy Court and the Asset Forfeiture Division. Once you sign these pages, the Hamptons estate, the commercial properties, and all remaining liquidated capital will be permanently transferred into your hedge fund's primary portfolio. The transition is completely bulletproof. Boss, there will be no room for appeals or challenging the transfer." I sat down at my desk and picked up my heavy silver pen. I opened the first folder. It contained the deed to the sprawling Hamptons mansion, where I had spent my childhood feeling like an unwanted ghost. I flipped to the signature page and signed my name with smooth, deliberate strokes. I opened the next folder. It contained the deeds to the commercial real estate properties, the very foundation of the empire my parents tried to use to protect their golden boy. I signed my name again, page after page, folder after folder. I methodically erased their legacy and legally absorbed it into my own. The assets they had hoarded to elevate Derek were now just numbers on my company's balance sheet, entirely stripped of their toxic history. As the ink dried on the final document, a profound quiet settled over the room. For 33 years. A deep, burning anger had lived inside my chest. It was the anger of a little girl who was constantly cast aside for a brother who could do no wrong. It was the fury of a teenager who was forced to pay for the mistakes of her own abusers. That anger fueled my late nights studying finance. It drove my ambition and sharpened my corporate instincts. I used it as a weapon to build my own empire from the ground up. Because I knew one day they would come for me. And I needed to be completely bulletproof. But as I closed the last folder, I realized the fire had burned out. The rage that had defined my entire existence had extinguished completely. In its place was something much colder and infinitely more satisfying. It was the undeniable reality of absolute independence. I no longer needed their validation. I didn't need to prove I was smarter or more successful than Derek. The legal documents proved it for me. I had completely dismantled the toxic hierarchy that suffocated me. And I did it without breaking a single law. I was finally free from their shadow. I didn't owe them a single explanation. Or a single cent. My legal assistant gathered the signed folders and quietly excused himself, leaving me alone in the dimming light of the office. I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet peace of the empty room. Then, my personal cell phone buzzed softly on the glass coffee table. I walked over and picked it up, expecting an email from a client or a market update from my brokers. Instead, the screen displayed a text message from Samantha. We had kept in touch over the last 6 months, occasionally exchanging brief updates about the legal proceedings. But this message was completely different. I opened the text. It read, "My father and I are hosting a large Thanksgiving dinner at our estate in Boston next month. We know the holidays can be complicated, but we would be absolutely honored if you joined us. You protected our family, Catherine. We would love for you to come celebrate with ours." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words over and over. It wasn't a demand for money. It wasn't emotional blackmail or a manipulative tactic. It was just a genuine, warm invitation from people who actually respected me. I typed a simple reply to Samantha, thanking her and gladly accepting the invitation. I set the phone face down on my desk, feeling a strange new warmth settle into my chest. For the first time in my life, I was actually looking forward to the holiday season. I walked over to the private bar in the corner of my office. I poured a generous measure of expensive, aged bourbon into a heavy crystal tumbler, appreciating the rich color as it caught the ambient light of the room. I crossed the plush rug and slid open the heavy glass doors, stepping out onto the private balcony of my penthouse. The cool New York night air hit my face immediately, but the bourbon warmed my chest from the inside. I leaned against the thick glass railing, looking down at the endless grid of streetlights and moving cars. This was the city I had conquered. Down there, millions of people were rushing home to their families. Some were returning to loving, supportive homes, while others were unknowingly walking into toxic emotional battlefields. For 33 years, I was a prisoner to a family that only valued me for what they could extract from me. They demanded my money, my time, and ultimately, my freedom. But tonight, standing hundreds of feet above the concrete pavement, I was completely untouchable. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the smooth burn ground me in reality. I thought about Derek. Right now, my arrogant golden boy of a brother was sitting in a small concrete cell in a high-security federal penitentiary. He traded his custom tuxedos and luxury sports cars for a scratchy orange jumpsuit and heavy steel chains. He would spend the next 8 years waking up to the sound of slamming metal doors, completely stripped of his fake billionaire persona. There would be no fancy restaurants, no high society parties, or rich in-laws. To save him, he built his entire identity on lies and stolen money. Now, He was nothing but an inmate number in a system that didn't care about his last name. His grand illusion had been shattered into a million unfixable pieces. Then, my thoughts turned to Beatrice and Richard. They spent their entire lives obsessed with appearances, desperate to maintain their status among the elite of the Hamptons. Now, they lived in a damp, peeling apartment next to a rusting trailer park. They had no money, no assets, and no friends. The wealthy socialites they tried so hard to impress had blacklisted them the moment the federal indictments dropped. They were forced to wear cheap clothes, buy generic groceries, and work exhausting manual labor jobs just to survive. They sacrificed their only daughter to protect their son. And in the end, the son they worshipped threw them under the bus without a second thought to save his own skin. The poetic justice of their situation was absolute. They handed me a notarized disinheritance letter, thinking it was the ultimate punishment. They thought they were throwing me out into the cold. Instead, they handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to sever my liabilities, take total control of their corporate empire, and leave them completely destitute. They engineered their own perfect destruction. I took another sip of bourbon, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction wash over me. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the quiet daughter taking the fall for a corrupt family. I was the CEO of a massive corporate debt acquisition firm. I was a titan of industry, managing hundreds of millions of dollars in capital. I had taken the very company my parents used to belittle me and absorbed it into my own massive portfolio. The legacy they tried to steal from me was now firmly and legally mine. I had completely rewritten the narrative of my own life. I looked up at the dark sky, watching the blinking lights of an airplane soaring high above the city skyline. I had finally found my peace not through forgiveness, but through relentless, undeniable accountability. I protected myself, and in the process, I forged a new family based on mutual respect and absolute integrity. I finished my bourbon and set the crystal glass on the small patio table, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought. Family is no excuse to be used as collateral. If they hand you a sword to fall on, take it and use it to cut the ties. Have you ever been the family scapegoat? How did you take your power back? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of sweet, undeniable justice.